Hi, thank you for tuning in to the Finding Harmony podcast with me, your host, Harmony Slater. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Harmony, and I'm here with Russell Case.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, we have an old-timey friend of yours.
An old-timey friend. Yeah.
Do you want to give your intro? I know you have something special.
I have an intro, and I'm just so thrilled. Gosh, our guest today is Elizabeth Kadetsky, Dr. Elizabeth Kadetsky, perhaps.
Just Elizabeth.
Just Elizabeth. Elizabeth is very much like the Paul Simon song, a 3-time Fulbright Fellow to India. Her most recent book that we're going to talk about today, if we can stop gossiping for a minute.
Yes.
Is the Juniper Prize winning lyric memoir, The Memory Eaters.
That one sounds so exciting.
Elizabeth is a professor of creative writing at Penn State University, nonfiction editor at New England Review. Her selections for the journal regularly appear in Best American Essays, and her nonfiction has been featured in the New York Times, as well as many other venues. Her ongoing research, which we're very excited about, is a set of stolen goddess sculptures from India, which appeared as a cover story in American Scholar last March. Her first book, which I have here with me, signed by all of the yoga students at Guy Donahay's Shala, is First There Is a Mountain, 2004, chronicling a year working with yogi BKS Iyengar, discovering his role in the history of Indian independence, complicated dance between the East and West. We're very excited to talk about that. Also, for those of you, what do you call that? You give a warning to people when there's content. What is that called?
A content warning.
Content warning. For those of you who might be triggered by eating disorders, this book is a great way of getting into eating disorders if you're looking to explore having one.
We should talk about this book because, like we were saying, we were just mentioning, I was telling Elizabeth that I was in Mysore in 2004, and this book, There Is a Mountain, her book was published in early 2004, and it was the book of the year, the yoga book to read, and you were very, very famous at that time.
Yes.
Amongst yogis globally, I think.
The first time I had a student that was famous, and it was like a little thrill.
Yeah.
So thank you both for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm just so honored that you know the book and remember it, since it's kind of in its golden age right now. But thank you so much for that great intro.
It's hard to believe almost 20 years ago, right? Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. But it's interesting, like we were mentioning, at that time there was really there was some technical yoga books, like maybe John Scott or David Swenson or Iyengar Light on Yoga. Like they were all about asana, and there wasn't really a book that was written from a cultural perspective that was a yoga book. Like nobody was writing about yoga as like a part of their life or a journey that they're on or spiritual practice or anything like that. So it really was kind of the first of its kind.
Yeah, that was very much my idea for it, that I noticed a dearth, and I was a journalist, and I was getting my MFA in creative writing when I started working on the project.
Mm-hmm.
And I just was very aware that there was nothing narrative and personal about the yoga world at all. So I set out to do it. And afterwards, a few books like Elizabeth Michaelis's book came out, and a couple of other cultural histories of early 20th century yoga. But I was excited that I had found this niche that nobody had filled yet.
Yeah, totally. It's incredible.
Can I ask you about the jacket design? Kim Yuri and Josh Ghostfield. I think Josh did the illustration. Yuri did the jacket design. This, at the time when this came out, it's hard to describe like how you can really tell someone who's been to India and has visited and who hasn't. And it's like, this is such a, like, it had this kind of substance to it. Like, this is a real thing. This is someone who knows who knows it. Can you describe how that relationship?
That is amazing that you picked that up from just the cover of the book. So, Russell, perhaps you know Josh from the New York art world, Josh
Maybe,
Gosfield. He
maybe
is
if I
a
saw his face, I would know.
wonderful artist. I am sure you have crossed paths with him, and he's fairly well known in the art world. And at the time, he was doing a lot of cover illustrations, and he and his partner Claire were really into yoga, so it was a great match, and I got to meet them and talk about it. Again, because this was really early for talking about the culture of yoga. There was Yoga Journal, but there wasn't
Right.
that much else out there. We were still trading in cliches. So the obvious first go-to was, you can probably guess, lotus pose.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I communicated with the staff at Little Brown and I said, one thing, no lotus pose. And they were just horrified. They really wanted lotus pose on the cover. And but Josh did some great work looking into Indian miniatures. So he found that background.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I think the first version actually was lotus, and it was
Yeah.
me. It was not good. Maybe Josh didn't do this part. Maybe this was just the designers. It was an image of a woman from Yoga Journal, basically in
Oh
lotus,
no.
with my head morphed on top. And it was supposed to look like it was me. I was like, well, you could just get a picture of me doing lotus, but also
Yeah.
no lotus. And then so we had all these negotiations, and
Also no.
finally, finally I was like, what you should really have is Tadasana, because, it's like
Right.
that's
A
the point of
mountain.
the title, right? First there's a
Yeah,
mountain. They were like,
Yeah.
right.
yeah, they were like, that's kind of boring. So
Right.
Hmm.
the compromise was Shirshasana, and then we had to
Yeah,
negotiate further because I thought it would be really cheesy to have my face on the cover. So
Right.
we agreed to do it from the back, and we did a photo shoot, and that's me in
yeah,
Shirshasana.
Oh,
yeah,
amazing. It's
and
beautiful. I think it's so nice that you don't see the face actually,
yeah.
because it allows you to
Yeah,
like put yourself in the image, which is wonderful.
yeah, I
There's
agree.
also a touch of this, because it's your body, and and then the back is revealed in the picture.
It's
You can
beautiful.
also see, maybe I feel like we might be touching on these kind of hot topic words like authenticity and legitimacy.
Mm.
We might be kind of exploring that today. But there is, as a professional yoga teacher, a there is the substance of authenticity in the pose, though I would perhaps tell you to point your toes a bit more. But in the back, you can see the work, the 10,000 hours of work in your
Yeah.
back. It's like, oh yeah, she knows
Mm.
exactly what the fuck she's doing.
Because the
She
back
knows how to
muscles
do it.
are, yeah.
And there's also kind of, which is also kind of beautiful. Um, she's a bit thin, and she's a bit too thin. And that's such a lovely metaphor for the arc of the story itself, which touches on, our our culture in yoga for kind of craving being a bit too thin. And that was, I was also triggered in the book because I would read it and it's like, oh, that sounds really really good. I want to kind of be a bit too thin. I want to be that spacey. And I also adore and love the feeling of being spaced out from not eating, where some people get really aggro,
Yeah,
like you hear about people getting
Mm. Hangry.
yeah,
like I've never been hangry. I've always only ever been, just blissed out. It's like, oh, thank God I don't have to eat. Yeah.
yeah,
This is how,
yeah,
like, this is triggering for anorexics. I'm not kidding. And it's like, because it's also
yeah.
a part of Harmony and I, it's part of our psychology as well to be triggered negatively or positively, depending on your point of view, by eating disorders. Can you talk
Mm.
about that? Was your editor, your publisher, a big fan of having that piece to the book?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about the publishing industry, which continues to be extremely whimsical and quixotic, and they're always, chasing the the latest trend. And so the various hands involved in this book project often had different agendas. So the
Right.
person who I'm very grateful to for stewarding this book from my idea, here I was a grad student in an MFA program with this crazy idea, and I found an agent from New York who came to visit the grad school and was interested in possibly representing people from the program. And he took it on. And his version of it was extremely melodramatic and a little bit cliched. And he would use, he thought of it as a memoir, except that the way he pronounced memoir was memoir. And
Oh, that's awesome.
and
Oh.
so he really framed it as this narrative of a woman. Okay, this was before Eat, Pray, Love. You have to
Right. Yeah,
Right.
imagine
yeah, yeah.
yourself into this moment in history, which it's hard to
Yeah.
even remember that that moment exists.
Yeah.
So I think he was
Mm.
hoping
That would have
to
been,
do, like, we can't say the next Eat, Pray, Love. I think his vision was that we were going to do the first Eat, Pray, Love, and of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah.
um,
yeah, more
you know,
sex,
I
definitely.
mean,
Yeah.
and idealism and
Yeah.
cliches about the other and
Yeah.
romanticism about the East and a little
Orientalism.
bit of,
Yeah.
thank you, Orientalism. That's the word.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I mean, right. I mean, Russell, like, we know from where you and I met in the yoga world and in Mysore that, like, this is not where we are coming from at all, and it wasn't where I was coming from. But he really liked that narrative. So it was like a woman in her. They also kept getting my age wrong. They kept saying I was in my early 20s, which I wasn't. I was already around 30. And but that was just the cliche that they had in their mind, like, oh,
Yeah.
this young woman right out of college is suffering from anorexia and goes to India to find herself. And that was not the book
Mm.
I wanted to write at all, but I did want it to have a personal angle.
Yeah.
And that was part of it. I mean, that was the reality
Mm.
of what I was dealing with when I wrote the book. So I thought that there was a way to do that organically and have that give the book a kind of narrative center of, like,
Yeah.
who I was and why I was doing this. And I think that that's true for any book, that you need the narrator to have that sense of purpose or quest. But you can see that that particular one would be easy to exploit by
Yeah.
the publishing
Hmm.
industry. So, um,
Absolutely.
and it's so funny, like the book by its cover idea. I do really like the cover, but if you do read the promotional material in the book, it really tells one version of what they were trying to sell. And you can kind of see that the actual book is different from that. So you have to
Yeah.
read the book and be like, wait a minute, this is like a journalist who is, deeply
Yeah.
committed and involved in the yoga world, and also deeply committed as a writer and journalist writing the story. Anyway, I
Yeah.
haven't said anything about anorexia. So, um, yeah, but the eating disorder part of it, I saw how we see this in Iyengar's introduction to Light on Yoga, where he says the best way to practice yoga is in a bug-free space with no food, first thing in the morning before you eat. And if you really, really need it, you can have coffee before you
Right.
practice. He actually
Mm.
says that
Yeah.
in Light on Yoga. So
Mm.
it is the culture coming from India of this form of yoga, that you fast while you do it. And of course, fasting has all those spiritual dimensions, of course.
Hmm.
But
Mm.
then, isn't that interesting when you overlay that onto American culture and thinness worship,
Hmm.
Mm.
and
Yeah.
exercise abuse, etc. And there you see one of the central contradictions that I was trying to get at in the book. Here were a lot of people, like us, going to India to um, meet these amazing teachers and practice as part of this amazing community. Some more committed and more knowledgeable or educated than others. And I think we've all seen that tendency of people to kind of come and see it differently. See it as like the Eat, Pray, Love version of
Yeah.
Hmm.
going to study with Patabi Joyce or Mr. Iyengar.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I love that you brought up Iyengar's. Let's just talk about Iyengar a little bit for fun, and we can also get back into the eating disorder things. I have some thoughts about that also, but but
Experiences.
I can't help but think of this idea sort of Orientalism and sort of how you idolize, like coming from the West, sort of the ideal sort of mystical spiritual India that we really sort of
Create out of thin air.
create, right? That it
Yeah.
has this sort of eat pray love vibe about it when you're just sitting over here in the West thinking about it.
As Edward Said said, there is no thing called Japan. It is a thing the West has created.
Right. Yeah, like culture
Mm,
so much
that's
more
good.
dynamic and complex and paradoxical than this, putting them in a box. But it reminded me because I also met BKS Iyengar in person. I went to Pune to his center there, and he was in the library, and we were just touring. We weren't
Oh,
students, so we weren't
great.
really in the fold, but went and purchased his, I think it was the Tree of Yoga book, and had him sign it,
Mm,
and had a
mm.
little chat. And it was really funny because I been going to Mysore and spending time with Patabi Joyce, who has a very jovial personality. He's very warm and loving and laughing all the time and welcoming.
Also a bit cynical.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had maybe a dark sense of humor, but who knew, because he didn't speak English that well. But then you have Iyengar, who does speak English quite well, very well.
Yeah.
And also, I think, potentially a dark sense of humor, but also very grumpy. Like all the time, he's always like really strict and stern. And I remember asking him,
Yeah.
like, "How are you today?" Like, "I'm fine." And, "Are you having a nice day? What's good about it?" Like these were, and I was
Wow.
like, "Okay."
That's like New York in the 70s. That's great.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about your sort of experience of these two different worlds and cultures and
Could I just give a footnote?
yeah.
I was sitting in Patabi Joyce's office, and I pointed out the yoga journal that was
Yeah.
in the office on his desk
Yeah.
with,
Iyengar
or
on
maybe it
it.
was Namarupa, but it was Iyengar and Patabi Joyce hugging.
Oh yeah, when they did
A-
that for his 90th birthday.
And I pointed to it to Patabi Joyce. It's like, "Oh, Guruji, you have the Namarupa," and he took it and he kind of tossed it over to me. He said, "Yeah, now we are friends."
Wow.
Because I mean,
Yeah,
at the
that
time
is
that you wrote this book also, and like through history, there was a quite
Tension.
like a little bit of animosity
yeah.
between the two of them, and
Yeah.
between the two cultures, and between the two
Yeah.
practices. And it
Yeah.
was like a
Yeah.
really big deal when they got together for that 90th birthday and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it
became
was
friends.
epic. And epic rivalry. Although it's funny, I always imagined it coming more from Iyengar's side. So that's interesting to hear Patabi
I think
Joyce's version
yeah.
of it.
Contempt for Iyengar, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is it probably was equal, right? Like they were probably both sort of in
Interesting.
this. Yeah.
Well, Iyengar, I mean, Iyengar was just such a wonderful 19th century character from literature.
Yeah.
And how could you not want to write about him? He was so complicated and so intelligent and so intuitive and, really not educated. I mean, completely self-educated and so torn. And he had such a big ego. And then his children, once they got involved, they could be extremely petty and um, possessive and competitive. And so I think by the mid to late 90s, they were a big piece of what was going on at the studio. And they could be very mean. And I think the next generation is often more orthodox than this
Yeah.
creative genius who broke all the traditions in order to
Mhm.
found something
Yeah.
extremely original and creative. But as soon as you get to the next generation, it becomes orthodoxy. And
Mhm.
so they were very, very concerned about maintaining the orthodoxy of what
Mm.
Iyengar had created, which is completely paradoxical because what he created was in its nature unorthodox and
Yeah.
made up and brilliant, a brilliant system of his own. So I think that then reinforced his own sense of like he's doing it right, other people are doing it wrong. He's the authentic heir to Krishnamacharya, who had clearly abused Iyengar anyway. So
Mhm.
you put that family trauma into the picture, and then of course sprinkle in um, not just Orientalism but colonialism, and that
Mhm.
Iyengar lived through, really the worst of the colonial era in
Mhm.
India, and was in the thick of it, and um, was really somebody who completely believed in yoga as a philosophy and that was the most important thing. But around him, the world was completely falling apart and people were trying to claim yoga for their own purposes. And so you
Mhm.
see in his life story that he goes back and forth several times between different political movements, depending on which movement is going to help yoga the most. But of course,
Right.
that's not how the political movement saw it. They were like, oh yes, we have Iyengar on our side, we have yoga on our
Right.
side. And also where he was in Pune, that was a hotspot. Pune is where, oh God, I'm going to get his name wrong, but Gosale, the assassin, Gandhi's assassin,
Mm.
was from Pune.
Oh,
So
okay.
Pune was a hotbed of not just the independence movement, but then these factions within the independence movement.
Mhm.
And that never stopped. Once Congress Party came into power after the 1940s, um, the right wing movement that slowly built up that we have now that tried to unseat um, the Congress Party, which were they were socialist more or less. That movement really got its start in Pune as well. So it's a really
Uh-huh.
political
Wow.
city, and he
Mm.
was able. And then if you put on top of that the Osho ashram was also there in
Yeah.
Pune.
The
So you have
Osho
these
ashram.
crazy, Westerners coming through, just acting really badly, and all this is
Recently exiled from
happening.
California. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was a little bit later, but if you look at
Later, yeah.
Iyengar's, whole life story, so there was a lot going on, and I think I mean, in the book, I really kept coming back to his really fraught relationship with colonialism and
Mm.
post-colonialism and his encounter with the West. That I think he had a little bit of like survivor's guilt. That he was from this Orthodox background. He was not supposed to travel to the West. If you're a Brahmin Sri Vaishnavite, you're not allowed to go over the water. There's a restriction about that,
Wow.
and he and of course many other great Sri Vaishnavites did it, but going to the West was breaking tradition, just even that. And then also on the
Yeah.
ship, there are several different people from that community of Brahmins who write about it, going across the ocean on a ship and not being able to eat the food because the rule
Mhm.
is that you can only eat food cooked by another
By
Sri Vaishnavite
Brahmin.
Brahmin.
Mm.
Mhm.
So he, kind of starved himself on the way over. But then when he got to Europe, he had to give up that injunction and eat the food, but he stayed vegetarian. And there's a great story, I think it's in his autobiography, or yeah, in his autobiography, he talks about he was working for the great violinist Yehudi Menuhin, and I think before that he was working for Clifford Gerst, another musician in um, Switzerland, and they would give him basically he would eat peas for dinner because they didn't understand what a vegetarian diet was. So they would just give him the sides, but they wouldn't give
Yeah,
him
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
extra.
yeah.
No.
That's also how I ate in France. It's the
Here's a
same.
pea.
Yeah, yeah.
Just the sides.
Peas and
Yeah.
potatoes.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. But no, like extra. So
no.
anyway, where was I going with that? Like who he was as a person, and then yeah,
Mhm.
and then by the 70s, he had this cohort of Westerners, not just Americans, from all over the world, who became very close to him, and I think he saw them as his children in a way, and he was very attached to them. But then it became difficult, I think, because people in India felt that he was abandoning them and that they should be
Mhm.
his children. And so then here you see another rivalry. And there's this history of these petty rivalries that
Yeah.
kind of follow him through his whole life story.
Yeah.
I think it's
Wow.
super interesting to think about how that film was made in the 1930s, 1936, is
With
it? With
Krishnamacharya and
Krishnamacharya.
Iyengar and
And
Yeah.
then the Light on Yoga book. And I have the sense that these things were created because of his contacts to the European elites that he was meeting, and he was getting capital to make these things. But it seemed like, as positive developments as those were for um, exporting yoga to the West, or allowing the West to extract these things and exploit them, however you want to call it. Um, the, it seemed to be a point of contention between him and his teacher Krishnamacharya. Like, it seemed like they created a really deep rivalry, and even like, this is where Patabi Joyce's um, uh, enmity for Iyengar kind of also is, because Patabi Joyce was nothing if not
Mhm.
incredibly competitive,
Mm.
and created
I think they
competition
Yeah.
all
between
were. I think
it
that's the
created
point.
and created
Yeah.
a culture of competition in his own progeny, in his own family, and his students.
Wow.
Mm.
So sad. So sad. Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, I forget the details of the story, but Krishnamacharya was very angry at Iyengar, and I think it did have to do with the publication of Light on Yoga. And as I'm remembering, he told him not to publish it. And if you think about it, the coming back to this idea of orthodoxy, in the context of Indian orthodoxy, the number one thing you can't do is eat meat. Number two, you can't eat food cooked by someone else. Number three, you can't travel over the ocean. Number four, you cannot stand up to your mentor, right? That
Right.
the elders are in charge. And even, Russell, I know both of you have spent time in India. Children are very indulged and loved, but they are meant to be obedient. Um,
Mhm.
and that idea of a paternal obedience, it was very deep in the Iyengar teaching tradition,
Mhm.
and I think in Patabi Joyce's as well.
Yeah.
But what did Iyengar do? Here we go, another paradox. He flouted his master and went and did what he wanted. And he wrote
Right.
Mhm.
his book, which he wasn't supposed to do, and then he completely changed the system that he was taught by
Mhm.
Krishnamacharya
Yeah.
and did his own thing. So, wow, how does somebody, in mid-century India, in this colonial context, how does somebody do that? What kind of person is that? It's just so fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that that strength of character in a way, right? Like you were saying, he had a very large ego. That was
Ego.
my impression as well. But but for almost like a purpose, in the sense that it was what was forging his way forward. Like he had to have such a belief in himself and in what he was doing in order to create all of this newness in a
Yeah.
tradition that, from especially his perspective, was thousands and thousands of years old in a way, right? So like, to be an innovator, I think, requires a lot of
Courage.
yeah, courage, but also confidence, like, that shows up in a certain way, I guess, a lot of the times. Right.
Well, so that's a question I have for you. What do you think, if you look at what Iyengar did and what Patabi Joyce did,
Mhm.
to what extent do you think that they believed that they were communicating something ancient and authentic?
I think Patabi Joyce did in the sense that he would always say though, like he would always say, "This doesn't come from me. This isn't Joyce yoga.
I'm just going to
I'm
take
not
this
the
hand
creator
grenade. I'm
of
going to offer
this."
it
No,
to the
but I think
host.
he really believed he was.
Oh, man. What a...
No, don't you think Patabi Joyce
Russell, I
believed
think
he
he
was?
disagrees.
I think
I...
Patabi Joyce was a true believer. I think he really believed that he was like,
This is how my teacher taught.
this is how my teacher taught. This doesn't come to
And
me.
then
This
my...
yoga belongs to no one.
And
How many
my
times do we hear that?
And my teacher's learning this from
Rama Mohan Brahmacharya.
And then Manju is sitting right next to me saying he never went there.
Yeah, I mean,
oh, the Tibet story.
Yeah,
right?
The Tibet story. Yeah.
Nobody believes that story, right? I mean, that,
I think
right, like the cognitive
Krishnamacharya's
dissonance
offspring does.
Do you think? Yeah, that I really wanted to pursue that further. Right.
Yeah.
And also
you
the
did
story of
you did a whole bunch of research on this topic of how far
I
back it goes.
did.
You went and looked at the ancient readings.
Well,
no, but they've never found that the one that got eaten by the ants.
No, but she went and she did you did investigative journalism on this topic.
Yeah,
and what did you
I did
discover? That no one actually believes it.
Yeah, nobody believes it. That the yoga rahasya story, and that it was eaten by rats. Well, yes, that's true. A lot of manuscripts do get eaten by rats in libraries, but this was there was the story about how Krishnamacharya went and sat under a tree, and the yoga rahasya came to him,
like the Buddha,
and then he transcribed it. And so he did transcribe it. So that does exist. That's out there.
Right.
But whether that's the same document as the rat-eaten version, no, I don't think anyone believes that. Or was that a different text?
That was a different text. The one that got eaten by the ants. Yes. The
Yoga Karunta.
Yoga Karunta.
Oh, the Karunta. Again, the Yoga Karunta
is under great debate whether it ever really existed or not.
That's right. That's right. And then the trip. I didn't really get that far in documenting the trip to Tibet, but there was definitely doubt about whether it happened, and I did look into some of the royal palaces that maybe he would have stayed on his way, to try to see if there was ever any evidence of yogi from South India coming. But I mean, you can't prove a negative, and so just because it didn't turn up in the sources that I looked at doesn't mean anything. There was I think there was one document from like the viceroy where he was given a visa. To go.
Puts a photocopy of that or maybe his Deskachar's book has a photocopy of that viceroy visa.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's all we have. But even still, I think that so there are the medieval yoga texts, and then there's kind of a blip, and then we get to Krishnamacharya and some other people in the early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, who were practicing yoga. And the medieval yoga is very varied. There's quite a lot going on. There were those cults where people would raise an arm in the air for their whole life, or sit in a particular position, and all these different versions of what you could call yoga, because it was this tantric idea that like through the body you could reach universal consciousness. So connecting that up to what Krishnamacharya was doing, even if he learned it from Rama Mohan, up in the cave, who was how old? 260 years old. That like yoga. I mean, yes, yoga existed. There was a continuous tradition, but it was not ever one tradition. There were so many versions of it, and this one thing somehow did get to Krishnamacharya, and there are the paintings from the Mysore Palace. Like, there's definitely continuity, but part of that is Western, right? The wrestling influence.
Yeah. And the
who's
gymnastics
the
influence, which we all learned about
who's
in Yoga Body.
the yoga body? Mark Singleton's yoga
Yeah.
body is something that I passionately
Don't
I
lie.
have passionate feelings about. And Krishnamacharya going to the Kavalyadam, is that where he went? The Kavalyadam, where the Dutch Olympic team was training?
No, that was the palace.
No. He went up. Don't make me stop the interview and go get the book out of our closet. There was in Mark Singleton's yoga body. There's a narrative point where Krishnacharya went north
To Benares?
to Benares
I don't know.
and
Yeah.
studied there. And
Yeah,
at the
we
same
went
time that he was there, there was a Dutch Olympic team who were doing all of these movement exercises, and the implication being that Krishnacharya learned these
Exercise.
movements from the West. And so
Ah.
therefore Ashtanga yoga is actually a Western form in its origination, which I find extraordinarily racist. Because the idea that any indigenous people couldn't come up with gymnastics of some, handstands and flips and backbends on their own, I think is an extraordinarily racist thing to say. And when I look at a lot of, like Persian
Art.
you sometimes
Yeah.
see 12th and 13th century yoga poses,
Mm-hmm.
and you look
Yeah.
at them, and you look at someone in a handstand, or you look at someone doing
Yeah.
something, and it's like,
Yeah. You do.
wow, you have to be a fucking athlete to be able to do that. And human beings can do that all over the world. Human beings can do handstands.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
train yourself to learn how to do a handstand and a backbend. And it just, the
Yeah.
idea that something can't spontaneously arise of its own accord, and it just drives me up the wall. At the same
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
that, like, it's just the same thing with the word Hinduism, right? That if we want to project onto India a whole form and we're going to call it this, then we're going to get it wrong. Because Hinduism doesn't really exist. There's 10,000 traditions that are all south of the Indus Valley. Just as like there are 10 million yoga poses for each person, and there's 10 million forms of that families have come up with. And in one particular case, Patabi Joyce learned something and it became very popular, and we want to legitimize it because we want to extract legitimacy and authenticity from our colonial mindset. And cool, we want to do that. That's awesome. That's how we like to run the world. But it doesn't mean that it exists, and it doesn't also mean that it's negative that we do it.
I think this is so rich because I agree. I do agree with you. The Mark Singleton book, I have not read that chapter. I have to go back. I've read I read some chapters from it while it was in the making, and I was excited about it. However, right, okay, so great research to find out that the Dutch team was there and that they were doing their version of gymnastics, and that's really cool. But I completely agree. That's so reductive to then say that, oh, he brought it back and that's where we get upside down poses, because you're right. In the Indian miniatures, you see so many upside down, rishis, and obviously this was going on, this upside down stuff, and right, gymnastics and physical feats for sure. But I think that it's really there's a whole other layer here that we in the West can't see the extent to which we're being influenced by right-wing politics, the right-wing politics of India. And it's really insidious and important to push back. And so the agenda of the BJP in India is to claim authenticity for everything. And upon that premise lies a very dysfunctional, toxic political regime that is extremely racist and that gets away with violence against Muslim people, not to mention, microaggressions, on a scale that we don't even see in the US. So to push back a little bit on that agenda that like
Yeah.
everything, that India, this fantasy that India existed in a vacuum, and
Mm.
that this pure tradition that's purely Indian could even have existed ever is
Right.
such a fantasy, but it's this fantasy that is being fed by the BJP government
Hmm.
constantly in India. And so I think um, if you study in India and you go to a yoga studio, you're likely to kind of hear that agenda in one way or another. And if you're a foreigner, you won't know these layers of context that are behind it. So I think it's false to say that anything is purely Eastern or purely Western. And so Russ, I completely agree with you that no, Patabi Joy, I'm sorry, Krishnamacharya did not witness Dutch gymnasts, and that's why we have a gymnastic-like element in physical yoga. That's so reductive and simplistic. But I mean, even those paintings at the Mysore Palace and the Norman
Mm-hmm.
Somont book. I mean, I think those do document that there was this gymnastic tradition. And then there's also the book by Joseph Alter, which came out before my book. It's an academic study of physical culture movements in India,
Mm.
and how they were tied in with the independence movement in the 1920s. It's a fascinating book. It's really good. It's academic, but fantastic research. Um, and that really did convince me that there was this long-standing interchange of Eastern and Western ideas,
Hmm.
and that
Yeah.
you have hatha yoga going on in India, and then the 1920s you have all this physical culture coming in from Germany and England, and things were just going back and forth. And so now, if you go into a yoga studio, a random one in New York or wherever, and they're like, "We're going to do yoga," and you're like, "That's weird. That looks like gymnastics to me," right? Like it's just things are really, really meshed together. And
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
this goes all the way back to Alexander the Great, or not so great,
Exactly.
but
That's what I was
who
just
that.
thinking about. Yeah.
So and even if you look at Ayurveda in India, right, that has
Yeah.
Greek. There's so much overlap with Greek tradition, and a lot of the art history, of course, has Roman and Greek influence. So
Oh,
it's not to
absolutely.
say that one is better, and nothing good ever came from India, or that people in India could never do something great. It's just that the world has always been a global place, and we should embrace
Mhm.
that. That's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
on
I
that
love that.
point, as an aside, which I think is really gorgeous, is that when you look at Indian statuary and you see the same asymmetrical um, interest in
Right.
the work, what you also see is a more living tradition, which is what we're learning about ancient Greek statuary, is that they were that garishly colored,
Oh yes.
but they're still
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
garishly colored. We call it garish because it's not white, but it's so because we're so fucking racist. But it's the garishly colored Indian statuary is what Greek statuary looked like,
Mm,
and
mhm.
if we had seen that, say 400 years ago, our aesthetic would be completely
Different.
transformed.
Well, and there, I think you do have racism, because we look at Indian artwork. We're like, look how
Yeah.
garish that is. Or they keep putting the, vermilion powder on it. They're just making it so ugly. But right now, walk into the Met, and they have this exhibit where they've repainted the Greek
Yeah,
statues with the
Oh,
colors,
amazing.
and it's
and there's
so
Yeah.
great to
such poor
see.
taste.
Right? I
Yeah.
agree. That is so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this touches upon a really fascinating thing that we like to talk about, which is the fluidity of these, the of culture and knowledge and teachings, and I think like what you're saying is so crucial, that it's like, how far back do we want to go to say that something originated somewhere
Hmm.
in a vacuum? Like I don't know that that's even possible, because you can just keep going back further and further and further, and we end up in a place where
Yeah.
everything originated
Yeah,
from.
it's like these
So
Foucault's pockets of history. Like
yeah.
it's more
Mm.
right to say a circle than a line.
Yeah. But I do think that
That's
when
great.
Patabi Joyce was like, when I say he was a true believer and he thought he was teaching something ancient, I feel like maybe it wasn't just the asana that he felt was ancient, but it was like the whole tradition of yoga, because for him, he was always talking about like yoga, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara,
Yeah.
dana, dhyana, samadhi. That is Ashtanga yoga. Like, he would just keep repeating these things over and over and over again, which to me is like talking about yoga as a whole lifestyle discipline, not just like, do the asana, even though that was what he was mainly teaching in a classroom type setting. But if you sat with him and talked with him about philosophy, that was really his passion. He was always reading the Vedas. He was always reading philosophical texts. He was always talking about the Yoga Sutras and yoga as like a whole life practice, not just,
Yeah.
Paschimottanasana and Shirshasana. And so I think he
Yeah.
felt like he was transmitting something that was ancient that way, and that it was like a living tradition that came from, the Vedas, as far as probably he was concerned.
He was convinced in his heart that we're at our base level incredibly ignorant. And so he had to start with the one thing that he could beat into our heads, which was the asana, and then we go from there.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
asana, right? But
Yeah.
I think what you're saying, Elizabeth, is really interesting too. This idea of using the body as a tool, or as a gateway to connect more deeply to spirit, or to something higher consciousness, right? And that
Yes,
the
I
body's,
agree.
it's this
That's
tradition of the body. And even when you were talking about Iyengar's, when you read Light on Yoga, like, not eating. And I mean, we got the whole thing too from Patabi Joyce, yoga's done first thing in the morning, 4 a.m. on an empty stomach.
right.
And,
4 a.m.
and
I remember that.
people started talking about intermittent fasting. And I was like, what? Well, that's just normal. This
That's
isn't
what
a
we
That's
do.
thing.
just what we do.
Well, so this conversation just gave me an idea that hear me out. This might be totally crazy, but since I know art is something that we share and that we've talked about a little bit, and since my current project is about Indian statuary and artwork.
Yeah.
Um, so here's an interesting parallel, that what if we were to think of our bodies doing yoga as a version of statuary? And so if you
Mm.
look at the relationship between Indian any object of Indian religious Indian statuary, ancient statuary, the relationship of that to the text that it describes. Um, the text is a point in time. The text isn't going to change, but over time, the way that that text is represented through artworks changes. So, what if asana, as we know it, or as Patabi Joyce learned it at that moment in time, was an expression of the text that was as specific to its time and place as any one of these artworks that we're looking at. So it's not a pure representation of the text. It's an interpretation of the text, or an appreciation of the text, or an expression of the text. And I think then if we can kind of place what we're doing in history in the same way that we would place art history in history, it might open up ways for us to think about it a little bit more fluidly, like this idea of authenticity. I mean, I happen to be staring at my bulletin board, which has like 30 Xeroxes of 6th century goddesses, because that's what I'm writing about. And
Amazing.
these are like, nothing could be more authentic than these goddesses, right? Like, they
Right.
were sculpted in India in the 6th century, and they're beautiful, and they're stone, and they still exist. And they they tell a story of the goddess Durga, and probably the text that they represent is the Devi Mahatmya, which is this really cool tantric text that deals with the goddess and the power of the goddess. But so that text still exists, and we can still go back to that text. It was written at a point in time, and it's fixed. But these sculptures were just that moment in time when they were sculpted,
Mhm.
how that text was represented in this physical form. So what if our bodies doing these shapes is a version of that?
Yeah.
I
Meaning
love
we are
that.
the goddess. No, sorry, that sounds
Yes.
crazy. But
We are the goddess.
But
For
that's
sure.
that
Oh, it's
would see, that's
amazing.
interesting. That would allow me a much more grace uh, in my ability to be compassionate towards what I'm seeing on Instagram.
Yeah.
And I can like, oh look, this is a really interesting interpretation of the time that we live in, and this is a,
Yeah.
you know, they're actual representations. They're art in the age of mechanical reproduction. They're mechanical reproductions in the same way
right.
that a statue is a mechanical reproduction. And it's
Yes.
wow, yeah. Yeah, instead of being, I'm because I keep looking at this mechanical reproduction on Instagram, this moving image, and I'm seeing a person that I have contempt for, rather
It's
than
a beautiful
seeing,
reframe, isn't it?
yeah, rather than seeing an art image that's trying to interpret history.
You're our guru, Elizabeth. You just
Oh,
like
yeah.
Well,
the
My
light
mind's
came in.
I think we have to embrace. I remember when I was in college in Santa Cruz and studying yoga, and I lived in this little cottage downtown Santa Cruz, and across the street was the Kali Ray yoga studio. And of course, up on the hill on campus, we were studying Iyengar yoga. But across the street from me, every day I would see Kali Ray go in with her long blonde, braids and the photos, and I was just like, that is profane. That is not real yoga. But I think that I think we should embrace the Kali rays and
The color rays.
um,
wow. Yeah,
they're
yeah.
prophets in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really beautiful way to kind of just like contextualize everything. Sort of like, even
Hmm.
what's her name? Jane Fonda, was
Yeah.
a representation of the 80s and the art form of aerobics.
Yeah.
And we can all kind of look back and appreciate that with
Except for the leg warmers, we've got to get rid of those.
No, no, no. Those are very helpful to stay warm. Yeah, it's funny. It's because, at someone somewhere is listening to this and saying, "Well, we're apologists for colonial appropriation," and it's like, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
sure. That's
Yeah.
it's nice to have cool things. You know, Japan has all kinds of colonially appropriated things, like the flower arrangement and sumo and Buddhism. These are all things that they appropriated because they were cool, and they also appropriated Elvis. I'm not upset about that.
Elvis.
And I didn't grow up far from the man. It's like you don't really know Elvis. And it's like, well, give him a break. They like him. He's cool. So I love that you contextualized the our conversation within Hindutva and the BJP, because there's insecurity there, and there's a pushback against colonialism and a nativist pride that you can admire, even if you're negatively affected by uh, racism. When you're in the yoga room, you can say, oh, this is interesting. This is a part of that
Mm,
movement,
mm.
and you can reframe the racism you're experiencing.
Well, yeah, we have so many rich ideas on the table. I mean, appropriation. I'm sitting here. I think I have the book. There's a great book by Paisley Rechtel called Appropriate or Appropriate. Um, and she goes through some of the
Oh yeah,
cases.
I heard about that. Good,
Appropriate.
please. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go
It's
ahead.
a good book. No, it's a good book. Oh,
Appropriate
here it is.
or appropriate? That's such a
Yeah.
great
Oh, and
title.
then the subtitle is A Provocation. And
Yeah,
she goes through some of the recent cases where people have been publicly excoriated for appropriation, and she kind of
sure.
examines them. One of the ones that she talks about is American Dirt, the
Mm,
novel that
mhm.
made more than $1 million, but was considered to be racist about Mexican people. I don't know. I mean,
Oh,
I don't want to throw away the whole appropriation conversation. I think it is important, and there are power dynamics, and Yeah, I think maybe it goes too far sometimes. Like a friend of
Mhm.
mine who has she's white, she has really thick curly hair, and sometimes she cornrows it. Well, she got doxxed for doing that
Right.
because that's appropriating a African American hairstyle.
Right.
So, but I'm trying to remember from the book Appropriate, I think that she comes up with not exactly a rubric, but a way of thinking about when one might be doing something appropriative in a way that is harmful
Mhm.
versus doing something appropriative that is celebrating the great,
Mhm.
diversity of and global context of humanity. And so, is if it's harming someone, um, maybe that's where we practice our
Yeah.
ahimsa.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then that's a really nice segue about your current research. I wonder if you could talk about
The
are
stolen
these are
goddesses.
these, we have a number of stolen statues. No, we bought them.
They're
It's
not
hard to
stolen. They were
say.
purchased.
It's hard to say, sometimes you buy things,
That were
and
stolen.
that were stolen. Mm. Can you talk
Yeah.
about this work that you're doing now? And we
Oh,
should also
great
talk about your
segue.
book as well, but we should talk about what you're doing.
So I for many years I found myself fascinated by stories. Really, this does tie right into the appropriation conversation.
Mhm.
Stories from a Western perspective of people who go abroad and cross a line, but don't really know they're doing it or rationalize it in one way or another. And so in my other writing and fiction, really, I had explored illegal adoption and the archaeology trade all over the world. So it was just always an interest of mine, and I had an opportunity to go back to India on a research project, and I thought this was in 20. It was 2018 when I wrote the proposal. I thought, I'd really like to just explore the topic and see what comes out of it. So in 2019, I went back to India on a Fulbright scholarship, just thinking I would look into the news that wasn't quite as big as it is right now about looting and the some of these Indian dealers who had been already arrested for getting involved in selling to Sotheby's, Christie's, the
Mm,
Met, et cetera, the
Right.
big um, purveyors of art, of
mm,
ancient artworks. And
Right.
I became increasingly fascinated by it, and I wanted to find one case where I knew where the objects came from and where they had wound up. And I did
mm,
find a case, which is this temple in southern Rajasthan, right on the Gujarat border. And it really had not been written about very much, but a few references to it were out there. And so I knew that they had wound up these sculptures in the Met, the British Museum, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. So that was all I knew. I wound up having a really hard time finding the temple. I started reading the art history on these sculptures, which were brought to the West in the early 1960s. And I noticed in all this art history, obscure art journals, nothing that I would have encountered in my normal life as a reader, writer, yogi. Um, I noticed, well, for one thing, I started to learn a lot about Indian art history and statuary, which was really fun for me because, I mean, that conversation that we just had about yoga and the body as a kind of artwork,
mhm.
that was my window. That was my way into learning about ancient Indian statuary through the
Mhm,
religious context for it.
mhm.
But then I started learning a lot more, and at the beginning of this project, I didn't know the difference between Gupta and Kushan and Gandharan, but now I can walk into a museum and I know um,
Well,
what school things are, and even more or less what century or what region things are from. So that was really fun for me to just immerse myself in a topic and really learn about it or a field. And this is what journalists do, of course. Um, but anyway, I started doing all this reading about these sculptures, and what I noticed is that nowhere ever did anybody ever talk about where they came from. It would say, oh, they're from Rajasthan, or they're from this town called Thanesar, but there was nothing about the place or the people or just the context that they came from.
How
So
or
I
how they were
wound up,
acquired from that town. Yeah.
or how they were acquired for sure. So
Mm.
I started asking around and following up each of the places where they had been written about, kind of going backwards through time. So they were referenced in a New Yorker article in 2007. So I contacted the journalist, and he was like, yeah, he hadn't actually gone to the temple. He just knew the story about the
Mm.
sculptures. And then going back, it was all art history. And I happened to know one of the art historians, so I contacted her, and she was like, oh, yeah, I don't know where the town is. And then I was looking on the map. I was like, well, I'll just go there. But the town didn't exist. So
Oh,
I was like, well, that's not so easy. Why doesn't it exist?
that's amazing.
So,
No one
yeah.
thought to check
So,
that out.
yeah, fact checking. Hello.
Mm.
So I wound up, asking around. I basically had to go to the area more or less where the
Yeah.
temple was supposed to be, and ask around.
Yeah.
And so this was with a cab driver who, spoke very little English, and myself who had, studied Hindi on and off for many years. Just kind of finding our way, and we wound up finding it. And I met a local family, and they helped me. And it turned out that the name of the place in the art history books was wrong. And now, was it wrong intentionally? Maybe not, because in the early 1960s, really, it wasn't part of the conversation that
Right.
you would go to the temple and ask people how they felt about the object being stolen.
Mm.
Um, but anyway, so that was just really intriguing to me, and I started doing more research and found a couple more of the sculptures in museums in the West, and two in India. So I've been to India twice now on the project, and I'm about to go back a third time.
Mm.
Um, and really just learning about the context that they were stolen in and what was going on in the early 1960s that created this opportunity for this looting trade to begin, and then what was going on in New York specifically and Los Angeles that made it seem okay to
Mhm.
export sculptures. There's a lot of conversation about, oh, well, was it legal or not legal, because there were these UNESCO guidelines that went into effect after these
Mhm.
sculptures were exported. But in fact, there were laws in India and in the state of Rajasthan that made it illegal. So they were illegally
Wow.
exported. And then there's a question, well, were they stolen? Well, there's one version of the story that somebody at the temple was bribed, and that that person arranged for the looters, the temple robbers, to come and take them. So is that a theft? Just what you're saying. Well, I bought it. Well, so is it stolen? So it turns out
Mm.
if you buy something stolen, it's still stolen, actually.
Mm.
And
Right?
I I learned this because my bicycle was actually stolen off of a scaffolding in New York City in around 2006, and I went to the bike store on Avenue B, and this guy who worked there was like, "You are going to get your bike back, and I'm going to help you. Here's what you do: walk around with a chain lock everywhere you go, and look for your bike. And I am sure that you're going to find it. And put the chain on the bike, and leave a note that says, 'This is my bike.'" He used saltier language than I'll use,
Yeah.
and you can take your lock off, or I will have you arrested. So anyway, I kept my eyes open, and sure enough, one day I saw somebody ride by on my bike,
Oh my
and so
gosh.
I
You
stopped
tackled
her.
them.
Yeah, it was this young woman who was half my size, and
Oh.
she had like the seat all the way down. I had it all the way up, And I was like, that's my bike. And she was like, how do you know it's your bike? And I was like, because it has a license on it from Penn State
Right.
University where you have to register your bike. And she was like, oh, well, I bought it at the Williamsburg flea market. So anyway, I negotiated with her and I got it back. But
Okay.
it was an
And she
interesting
walked home.
thought experiment. And yeah,
Yeah.
she did not walk home with her bike. I was like, you are liable. I mean, I had to think it through, but in fact, if you buy a stolen bike
Yeah.
from the Williamsburg flea market and the person who it was stolen from walks by, they can claim it. So sorry, that was a long tangent. But
Well,
these sculptures, okay, sorry. Interrupt me, please. Stop me.
No, I love that.
It just reminds me that 'cause one of my one of my favorite activities whenever we go is to
Is
go to
stealing things?
culturally appropriation is
You're
my
culturally appropriating rocks?
cultural appropriation, and Orientalism is one of my no harmony. Going to museum is one of my favorite
Oh,
things.
museums.
One of my favorite pastimes, and if I can go to a museum and put a good 6 to 8 hours in, then I feel like I've
Yeah.
really had a nice day. And I
Speaking
remember,
of which, we need these statue
well, wait a
images
second.
of them.
Yeah, we do. So
Oh,
one
here.
of the things that I'm reminded of
This
from
is the
what
most
you're
famous
talking
one.
about.
So beautiful. Oh,
This one is
I
in really
love
good shape.
We'll put
That
those
one,
in the show notes.
LACMA. Here, wait, I'll show you one more. Sorry, but Russell, I don't want to interrupt because you're
Well,
on
you
a.
can thank Harmony for that. She's the one that needs to
Oh,
apologize.
wow.
See, yeah, that has
These are
all kinds
gorgeous.
of influence from Greco-Roman civilization.
Wow.
Talk about theft. I mean, come on.
It's beautiful.
That's appropriation from
Yeah.
Greco-Roman civilization right there. Um, so I'm thinking about the museum and how much I enjoy the museum and how much I enjoy the opportunity that's afforded to me by living in a socialist utopia like the United States, where I can go to a museum and these things are made available to me as a citizen. And yet I'm reminded of an art professor who once said to me, "Is like the thing about museum is that it's not a museum, it's a mortuary, and it's
Mm.
full of dead things that no longer serve a purpose
Hmm.
to people. So these
Oh.
things used to be alive somewhere, and even
Mm.
if a painting is in someone's home, it's alive in a way that it's no longer
Yeah.
alive outside of the context of the relationship between artist and audience in a museum. And the same is true of sculptures. Sculptures, especially um, Indian statuaries, like these things are meant to be closed up at night, so they can be um, they can
They
be
can
made
sleep.
they can sleep and be made safe, and then you open them in the morning with puja,
Mm.
which brings energy into
Mm.
them. They become alive, and you become
Mm.
alive as you go through the process of puja. They're
Mm.
dead sitting in these boxes. You're looking at dead
Yeah.
sculptures, and
Yeah.
so the ethics of having anything in a museum is up for discussion. And I think you see that you're seeing that, I think, a lot of different places today. People are talking about whether or not
Yeah.
stuff should be given back. And because if this sculpture that you're referring to was in Rajasthan, in this community, they would keep the sculpture alive rather than
Yep.
just putting up,
Yep.
like we saw
Yep.
the corpse of Peter the Great in Moscow. It's like that should be buried. No one should have that corpse. Or
Wow.
the Lenin, like
Wow.
they should put Lenin in the ground. They shouldn't have him in a box like that. Mm.
So Russell, do you feel like your identity as an artist on one side and as a yogi on the other side, are they in conflict at all when you think of this problem of the beautiful Indian sculpture, religious sculpture in a museum?
Absolutely, because the sculpture doesn't belong there. And I look at it, and I'm at this stage in my life. I look at it, and it is unseemly to see an ancient Indian sculpture in the Art Institute of Chicago.
But we enjoy it nonetheless.
I'm really happy as a Yahoo
Yeah.
who grew up
Yeah.
downstate Illinois to have had the
Yeah.
opportunity to see those
Right.
things is really cool. And it was it was made available to me because my country is a colonial superpower, and like that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting this conversation about this because there are statues that are made in India that aren't like murtis, that aren't like holy statues in churches. They're just like made for artistic purposes. And it was interesting. A friend of mine told me a fascinating story about leaving India and having his I think he was leaving India and he had a carry-on bag and he got stopped
Oh yeah.
and they had asked him what was in it and he
Wow.
said a statue that he had bought it. And they gave him a really hard time and they said you can't take statues in.
Wow.
He was
Yes,
like
you can.
but I bought it in a store. Like, and then they were
Wow.
like making a really big deal out of it. And I was like, that's so weird. I've
That's
exported
again,
statues from India all the
but
time.
that's again the influence of the BJP on normal interactions.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so,
No,
I mean, he was also just like, listen, if you want it back, like, I mean, take it back. I have a plane to catch. I gotta go.
Yeah, but
was it ancient or was it new?
I
It
mean,
was new.
I don't know how old it was, but it definitely wasn't ancient. He purchased it in
Yeah,
a
that is so
Noah.
interesting. I mean, because that brings up that actually shows you what's going on with the BJP in
Mm-hmm.
India because the law is, I think it's 100 years. You can't
Right.
export anything more than 100 years old.
Yeah.
Um, but it does not surprise me at all that somebody working at customs would
Right.
have conflated this idea that anything that is religious or holy or spiritual cannot be exported because it is the god. But if you
Yeah.
think about it, even those little trinkets like the Ganesh that you would put
Yeah.
on your car dashboard, I mean that is a murti. I mean it is, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's
Yeah.
like something you could worship.
Totally.
Um, no, I think
I
it's
mean, but
really complicated.
yeah, and that's, I mean, kind of the interesting thing I think about Indian culture is, I mean, pretty much anything that you want to, I mean, a stone, right? I mean, we've taken stones home from the ganja that are in the shape of a lingam. I mean,
Wow.
is it a lingam? Is it a rock? I don't know, right?
I project lingams everywhere I look.
So, I mean, in India, like you can kind of they sell them too in shops, like rocks,
Yeah,
stones.
rocks that look like. Well, and again, I think this comes back to the conversation about appropriation. Things are so polarized right now and
Yeah.
black and white. And so this idea that, oh, well, anything, if you cornrow your hair, you're being
Right.
appropriative, as opposed to a more nuanced view, like in the book that we were just looking at, um, where it's like, well, is it causing harm? Or
Yeah.
is it taking it from someplace where it would have life? Um, so, yeah, Russell, I really liked your description of, you go, you do puja, the life force
Mhm.
flows between every body present in that situation
Mhm.
and what is happening in a museum. But I think, I mean, the kooky Kandinsky book about on the spiritual in art, and in that book, he would say the opposite, that when you have an artistic experience, that's the life force. That's
Mhm.
the communion with the object, and that
Mhm.
you could have that with a sculpture. I mean, in a good
Yeah.
museum that is drawing people into it and that has that kind of, to be appropriative, a kind of feng shui, of like
Yeah.
air, light, life, people moving through it. Um,
Yeah.
that's the ideal. But then there are the
But
bad museums where nobody
as
goes.
Right.
as an example, I could to set this up for you and our listeners at home. Imagine Trump had made a deal. This is impossible, but made a deal with the local Karnataka government, and they dug up the Nandi Bull on Chamundi Hill and took it and they sat it outside of the new modernist wing of the Art Institute of Chicago
Right.
and sat it there in Grant Park, and that's where the Nandi Bull is now. And that whole kind of all of those living traditions of worshiping the Nandi
Yeah.
bull and doing what's it, abhisheka,
Yeah.
doing abhisheka
And
on the
walking
bull,
around
walking
it.
around the
Yeah.
bull, pouring milk on the bull. All
Mm.
that's gone, and it's just teenagers spray painting their names on it, and that gets cleaned off
That's terrible.
every couple days. It's at a certain point, it's a disgrace.
Yeah.
And you think, well,
Yeah.
that's not right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's such an interesting idea. So were all these statues taken from the same temple, the same area?
Yes.
All 6 of them? They're
Yeah, the
like a
same
set.
temple. Yeah,
Oh,
the
Wow.
original set was actually 12 to 14 sculptures,
Oh, wow.
and
So
it
there may be
could have
more
been
out
two
there.
sets, but yeah, there could be more. The temple obviously is still there, although the temple is much more developed than it was at the time.
Right.
But they were all discovered by an Indian archaeologist in the late 1950s. And
Wow.
he wrote about it, and then he went back and got photographs of them. And so he photographed 10 of the sculptures. And then over the next couple of years, after the sculptures were mostly stolen, um, a few more photographs appeared in the literature. So it's hard
Wow.
to piece together exactly what happened and how many there were, but probably there were 12. But here's an interesting twist. Two of the sculptures were removed from the temple by the Indian archaeologist in the early 60s, so probably before the theft. So he
Right.
took them ostensibly to protect them, but also to bring them to an Indian museum where they would be
Oh.
appreciated as art
yeah,
by
Huh.
Indian people.
yeah.
And at the time, I mean, it's hard to imagine what Indian nationalism looked like then because it's so different from what it looks like now. I mean, right now it's Hindutva, 100% Hindu, everything. But that's not what it was at the time. After independence, there were these highly educated, idealistic people who were educated in the West or in a Western style who, again, embodied this global, back and forth of East and West, Eastern and Western culture. And so this archaeologist who, was Indian, lived in India, lived almost all of his life in India, he had been trained in Western art history and Western archaeology. And he and his cohort of archaeologists who also had been trained pre-independence, they believed that this wonderful artwork was not properly appreciated and
Mm-hmm.
that it should be appreciated not only in India, but everywhere in the West. And they felt
Mhm.
that this artwork was as spectacular, as sublime as Greek and Roman statuary.
Mm-hmm.
It should be considered classical art. And it
Wow.
Sure.
wasn't. It was considered archaeology or anthropology. And
Yeah, yeah.
so
Mm.
there was this mission in the late 1950s, early 1960s for Indian art to be recognized in the West. So perhaps some of the people in that cohort
Mhm.
wanted some of the artwork to go to the British Museum, to the
Mm-hmm.
Right.
it didn't initially go to the Met, but to the Cleveland Museum of Art was one of the top
Yeah.
Mhm.
museums at the time. So maybe that wasn't completely against what they would have wanted at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one wrinkle. And then another wrinkle is that these two sculptures that the archaeologist removed and brought to a regional museum, those sculptures are still owned by the Indian government. And
Oh,
one of them
wow. Yeah.
was moved to a different museum in Delhi, and one of them is still in this. It's not exactly the same museum, but it's in the same town. They moved the museum a couple of times. Um, and, neither is being displayed in quite the spectacular circumstances than the ones in the British Museum. Well, actually, the one in the British Museum is in storage, but the one at the Met, which was seized by law enforcement, it was beautifully displayed. So then there's this question of, well, the museum in India just doesn't have the same cultural place as it does in the West.
Right.
And So if you think about repatriation fever right now and all these sculptures being seized from museums and being sent back to India, well, what's happening to them, and what should happen to them, right? And I guess that's my question for you. What do you think? Where do
I
you
think
think they
it's
should? What should be done?
That's
I
a
think it's
fascinating
I think it's an
question.
incredibly
Wow.
profound question because it comes to the
Mhm.
heart of the mystic and religious experience. And you, as an artist, I'm trained to look at things, all things, with an aesthetic appreciation. And aesthetic appreciation is also the yoga experience.
Ah,
So these two things.
She's
that's
writing it
good.
down for later.
I'm writing it down. That is so good.
I'm so fucking flattered. Oh my god! I learned that from Richard Freeman. So that
Ah,
the aesthetic experience is also the religious experience. It's also the yoga experience because you have a physical phenomenological response to prakriti,
To beauty.
to things.
mhm,
Everything
mhm.
it becomes beautiful when you look at it with an appreciation for its elemental nature, which is stardust.
Mhm.
So this has all been recorded, Elizabeth,
Mm.
so you can listen to this later. so you look at something, you make something, you go home, you make art out of it, and then I'm not making art for my local church, I'm not making art for my local temple. I make art because I like to paint my walls with it. I like to self-decorate, and hopefully I'll get hired to do something for the church, and then I make some kind of Jesus painting for
Or the
them
city.
or for the city. Um, so the point that I wanted to make, though, before I got distracted by my own train of thought, I'm sorry, is um, you have a work of art that maybe arises in a church, and then it's taken out of a church and put into a museum, and then you should try and have the same aesthetic, uh, uh, the
Appreciation?
the same aesthetic appreciation, the same spiritual response to that thing that you do when it's in the church.
Mhm.
But then, okay, well, it doesn't belong to that country's museums. You have to put it back in the church or put it back in that person's museum, and so. But still, ultimately, it comes down to the individual's ability to have an aesthetic experience, and that's so
Mhm.
unique to that
Mhm.
person and to what
Mhm.
they can do with their body and their
Yeah.
mind and their whatever traumatic
Yeah.
background they had. So it's
But it makes me think, like, I mean, when we go to a museum, we go there to a museum with the intention of having this kind of experience. We go and we stare for
Yeah.
hours, but we
sorry.
spend time with the art, right? Like just looking and examining and looking.
Yeah.
And then the next time we go back to the same museum again, right? And we keep revisiting. I mean, as I'm sure you do, New
Yeah.
York has so many glorious places to go just have that experience and be just inundated with talent and expression and beauty and wonder, and it's so amazing, right? To have I mean, it is like a temple of sorts. It
Mhm.
is a holy
Yeah.
sacred place and experience. And in a way, when I mean, if all of these things were in personal homes or in personal temples or in, you would never have that kind of curated experience where you can just go to one place and just be like completely overwhelmed by appreciation for beauty in all of these different contexts, like ancient,
Yeah.
modern, all the different cultures, all the different, like it's an incredibly immersive experience that
You
really
don't
you couldn't have if everything's pieced apart, right? It only happens when it's
Yeah.
all together.
But this is incredibly cynical what I'm about to say. But at least in a museum, the museum is by design a democratic socialist institution that exists to educate all of the people of the community.
Yeah.
Where the church has
an agenda.
as an agenda.
Sure.
And they're trying
Mm.
to it's an anti-democratic agenda. It's quite, limited to a certain people, and who pay tithe to that group.
Right. I mean, and it's only one expression of something that has many expressions in a way too. I mean, depending on your point of view, but if the divinity comes in all forms, then I mean, it's kind of beautiful to have all the forms in one place. I mean, just throwing thoughts out there.
Yeah.
But I mean, and I like also what you're saying too about, I mean, also being from like a Western context and educated in a Western way, we do have this sort of idea already of like a museum and visiting a museum and appreciating art and it being something that's like within our cultural context, whereas maybe other cultures don't have this kind of history of, they would go to a temple or they would go to
or colonizing other countries.
Yeah, colonizing other countries and making, houses full of art, right? So it's not really in their culture. Like in India, they go to the temple every day typically and like do some worship or puja or just like go in and have an experience, whereas we don't have that in our culture. So we're not having this experience on a daily.
It's do you go to a church to have a mystic experience, or do you go there to get in line? I think is an important question. What's the
intention?
What's the intention of that
that's also
building?
interesting.
How you're dressed. When you're looking at something, I think can impact what kind of experience you're going to have. Are you going to have a mystic experience? Or are you going to have a critical experience? You're there to critically appreciate the context, or are you there to kind of vibrate in communion? And
I should wear loose clothing then? Is that what you're
think
saying?
I think we could all kind of let our hair down. Yeah.
I think this conversation kind of shows how just
it's
how
nuanced.
rich the topic is, and how there's not a easy, simple solution, and how I would say that we're in this craze right now of shipping sculptures back to India without a real clear plan for them, and that when you add to that the Hindutva government, which really sees the objects as symbols of colonialism. And so the conversation in India around repatriation is about righting a colonial wrong, which is totally legitimate. But it's a little odd because there's not that much conversation about the spiritual side of the sculptures. What we were just talking about, the puja, and how people would interact and give life to these statues on the one hand. And then there's really no conversation about the artistic value of the sculptures, which is perhaps appropriate since here we are Westerners imposing this art lens on it.
Right.
But the one of the problems that you see right now in the whole conversation is that the sculptures, when they get returned to India, it's not transparent. You can't actually always find them or figure out where they went. And some of them do wind up in storage for a while. Anecdotally, I've heard of cases where they've gone back to the temple. And I've seen a couple of news articles, so it definitely has happened. But the Indian government just opened a museum in Delhi. And it's the Museum of Repatriated Artworks. And so it is specifically a place for people to go and look at all of these artworks from different regions, different traditions, different time periods, and appreciate them in the context of their political symbolism, which is that they were returned in this kind of post-colonial bid, a power bid to get them back and get
That's
back stolen
interesting.
property, which is
Mhm.
totally legit. But I think it is a little odd that this is so front and center now for the
Mm.
value of these sculptures now, because we were just having this great dialogue about, do they belong in a museum where they would have one kind of spiritual, maybe
Right.
Western inflected experience, or do they belong in a temple or a church-like religious environment? But neither of those is what's happening, right? What's happening
Yeah.
is they're going back to a context where they can be appreciated as symbols
Power.
of an ongoing,
Power
of
struggle.
the power struggle and like the independence, war kind of
Yeah.
still going on, but
Wow.
reframed in this Hindutva kind of context.
Right.
Because
Wow.
you're not seeing Muslim art in this
Right.
repatriated
They don't.
Yeah.
artworks.
They
No,
have no desire to bring those back whatsoever.
no,
Yeah.
no.
No. And now you
So
probably didn't see
yeah.
the Muslims colonizing these Hindu sculptures and bringing them back to Persia either.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
interesting. It's
So
very
yeah.
political, which is kind of a fascinating circle we've come to because all of this, like, this I feel like the Hindu sort of emphasis and the political sort of power and all of that, a lot of it sort of builds with the consumption, with the appropriation in many contexts, with the movement
Hmm.
of the yoga to the West, and
Yeah,
yoga being
yeah,
so fully embraced and taken on and participated in by Westerners, right? All over the globe, and Easterners, and
yeah,
Japan, and Korea,
yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
and
Mostly.
China, and all the places,
Mostly.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's such a huge, um, I mean, gift, yes, that India's, brought to every country.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's fascinating how it then comes back into this political
Sphere.
agenda and story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
really interesting.
We have what we haven't done, which what I always like to do, and we haven't really had an opportunity, and we may have to call you back, is
Do part
I really
two.
wanted to interview you
Part
and
two.
find out how you ended up in our yoga studio in New York. I
Oh, the
wanted to find out
biographical.
how, I wanted to talk about your mom growing up in New York. I wanted to talk about you and
Yeah, there's so much you have such an interesting history.
what,
Oh, thank you.
Maybe we'll
find
have
out
to do part
Well,
1,
find
part
out how you've
2.
managed to
we'll do
keep
part
your
two.
your figure. We talk,
Oh yeah.
there's just so, and then you've also had this incredible, I don't even want to bring it up. You have this interesting history, and we haven't managed to do that at all because this has been such a phenomenally rich conversation.
Yeah.
This has been so fun. Well, maybe we should just say, um, Russell, when I came to the Shala on 8th Street, oh, and studied with Guy and with you, it was such a great experience, and we had such a great community, a little community in that studio. And wow, showing up at, I don't think it was 6 in the morning, but it felt like 6. It was probably 8. Um,
Even 6.
I was very, very grounding for me, and I'm just really grateful to have had that experience and to have met you there, and to still be connected to you, and that you had all those signatures for the goodbye notes from everybody in the community, and makes me think back about how I'm still in touch with many of those people, and what
Yeah,
a wonderful just moment in time we had together
yeah,
there.
it's
Mhm.
phenomenal. It was a phenomenal time. Yeah, yeah, I miss it.
Yeah, I do too.
Time just keeps moving on. We're all becoming ancient relics.
It's true. I was thinking about calling this episode Graceland because there are all of these references to Paul Simon. You, aren't you the girl that was recently awarded the Fulbright? We talked about Elvis. We talked about
Elvis.
all of these having grace.
Appropriation. Right?
Appropriation.
We're going to get in big trouble for appropriation, right?
Not-
in big
no,
Graceland. Graceland.
don't-
Oh my
No,
God.
we're not gonna dox Paul Simon for cultural
We're not going to
appropriation.
go there, are we?
No.
I love Paul Simon.
I started on a blog about whether or not Graceland was cultural appropriation or not. And I haven't finished it, but I started it.
Tough one.
It's just too good. You can't
It's
dox
so
Paul
good.
Simon. It's just too good, man. But anyway,
So everyone can get your books.
yeah, you have
First there was a mountain.
First there was a mountain, and then Memory
And
Eaters.
the Memory Eaters, which
We
give
didn't
us
talk
a
about.
quick synopsis.
No, we can't do that.
No,
We're gonna
just
have a part
quick
two.
One,
We're
just
gonna
like
have a part
a little
two.
tiny one.
Part two. We're gonna
'Cause
do
it
a part
sounds so
two.
good.
No, we got a part two. Oh, you have a quick synopsis?
How about I'll just give you the yoga version. So the book is full of memories, nostalgia, the past, some research about New York in the 70s and 80s. But I wrote it all in New York, starting right when we were studying together, when I was studying with you at the Shala. Around that time, my mother started to get sick with Alzheimer's. And my life, just became very ungrounded, as it would for anyone at that time. But it was compounded by my sisters being in recovery and living with my mother, and my feeling of just the loss of our shared history in this interesting time in New York. And then after a while, I was studying at Om Yoga, which was Cindy Lee's studio. And during that time that I was studying there, things really fell apart with my family, my mother, my sister. And I was biking over to Long Island City to take care of problems where they were living. Got to be every day, twice a day, and I would just bike back and go to I had an unlimited pass. I would just go to a class at Om Yoga, and it was kind of my life, especially for one summer because I work in the academy, so I have summers off. And I have a lot of yoga philosophy in there and a lot of scenes, mostly from Om Yoga and some of the teachers and some of the wisdom that I got from them. And one of my favorite moments was when Cindy Lee, who was studying with a Buddhist teacher as well, she came in one day and she said, I was at this retreat with my Rinpoche, teacher, and what I learned was, don't worry, it doesn't help. it just struck me. It was like, that is so true. Like, there is nothing I can do to make this situation better except, showing up and being present. But my anxiety, my stress, my not sleeping is not helping anything. So I guess maybe just keeping it, focused on the yoga side of that book.
Yeah, beautiful.
Well, that's a great title for this episode as well.
Yeah, don't worry, it doesn't help.
Don't worry, it doesn't help.
That's how I'm going to think about colonial appropriation going forward. So.
Colonial cultural appropriation. It's all just gonna happen anyway. We're just witnessing the unfolding of the universe.
We're just watching things happen. Artificial
Intelligence is in charge at any rate going forward, so we might as well just enjoy the ride.
Biden is a hologram, is what I learned from. Yeah. Well,
it was so beautiful to connect with you, and we really should do another interview with all of your
thank
yoga
you
stories.
So much. Well, this was just a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I did take some notes. It was you had some really good insights. I know you really did. Thank you, both of you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Finding Harmony. With me, your host, Harmony Slater. You can find out more information on my website, harmonyslater.com. and I look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Standing in eternity's shadow, watching the breaking waves, there's a hard wind